A new report from the Federal Auditor General says billions of dollars were wasted on COVID-19 vaccines, and even more was wasted on support payments for ineligible Canadians. Now, to chat about this in more detail is one of our regular contributors, Brian Lilley, columnist from the Toronto Sun, who joins us from the Big Smoke. Now, Brian, before we chat about ineligible payments through CERB and other programs, what did the auditor find on waste when it comes to the vaccination program?
Major waste, Hal, but I'd say that this is something most Canadians would look at and say, okay, understandable waste. What the Auditor General found was that 169 million doses were actually contracted for, and we've heard at various points up to 400 million doses have been contracted for, but there were different clauses as to whether the vaccines would be developed, would they be successful in going through trials and all of that. And so and she points out that early on they signed contracts with 7 different vaccine manufacturers. And I've had a lot of criticisms about the vaccine rollout in Canada, first starting with a Chinese company that fell apart, then being late to the party and being behind everyone else. I find that there's problems with that, but I'm not sure how much Canadians are going to be questioning the issue of overspending on vaccines to make sure that we got them in time. But still, it is a tremendous amount of waste. There were about 84 million, a little over that were sent out to the provinces and territories and administered to Canadians. But over 80,000, over 80 million that were not administered. 30 million that were 32 million, I believe, just looking down at the numbers. 32.5 million doses were donated. That was worth about $1 billion. Another 50.6 million doses were deemed surplus and offered for donation. Some of them weren't picked up on, and in fact, more than 13 million expired before they could be donated. So a lot of waste there. But I think on this front, Canadians will say, well, you had to buy before you knew what was going to work, so we'll give you a pass. This hasn't been an issue that's generated a lot of anger when we've written about it before at the Sun and elsewhere. So I don't see them getting anger on that. On the other issue related to support payments, I think you will find a lot of anger.
Yeah, let's chat about that for a moment here, Brian. Now, when the support programs such as CERB and the wage subsidy were in place, there were a number of stories surfacing about ineligible payments. How big of a problem was this according to the audit report?
Well, if you listen to the government at the time, there were no issues with ineligible payments. And how dare you question that? But we talked about it here on this show, that at one point there were senior bureaucrats saying, hey, wait a minute, we're sending payments to people who aren't eligible, people in jail, people who were living on disability support payments before and lost no income, people who, were applying for children that didn't live with them, all kinds of things. And the bureaucrat said, this is a problem and we should stop this. And at that point, it was only $1 or $2 billion worth of ineligible payments. And the political masters said, no, keep sending the money, get the money out the door. We don't care about the waste. This is COVID. Let's get to it. And to a degree, I can imagine Canadians saying, yeah, look, there's going to be some waste. We're trying to help people at the right moment. But now listen to these numbers. I want to read them to you. So for overpayments to ineligible recipients, we're talking $4.6 billion, including
Wow.
$3.1 billion paid to 1.8 million recipients who've received lump sum payments they weren't eligible for. There's another 27.4 billion, Hal, that the Auditor General says needs to be investigated further, including 15 billion to businesses who claim to have lost more money than they did when their claims to the support payments were compared and contrasted to their GST, HST filings. So that is a major bit of waste going on. We're talking about more than $30 billion potentially of ineligible payments. They've recouped about $2 billion. And this works out to about 5% of the COVID payments. There's another factor that I can elaborate on if you want. That is the fact that we were paying people more than they lost, and that's in this audit report as well. So far, not getting as much interest in the media reports out there.
And the taxpayers are on the hook. Wow, that's incredible. Brian, now we've chatted about Chinese police stations in the Toronto area in the past. Now there's a report of a new Chinese police station in Vancouver. Now you've investigated this. answer me this, are they actual police stations? And how concerned should we be about these reports?
We should be concerned about the reports, but we should also be wary about what is being reported. When news broke that there were three Chinese police stations here in Toronto, I visited the addresses, the locations that they were supposedly operating out of. One of them was a home in suburban Toronto, out in the Markham area. Another was one of these buildings, where offices set up in an industrial park, and it was all legit businesses. And the third was a convenience store.
Well,
So these are not police stations per se. I'm told that, look, people are operating out of these locations and they go out and they intimidate the local Chinese diaspora community, that they will come up to people who have moved here and say, look, you're wanted back home, or one of your relatives did something wrong. You better come back to Canada, or back to China. That is apparently what they're doing. It'd be more correct to say they're intimidation stations. They're not a police station where you're going to go down and file a complaint about somebody, where Chinese police in uniform are going to go out and arrest somebody. None of that is happening. Now, according to some reports, that does happen in other countries with large Chinese populations, and we're talking about developing countries less affluent than Canada, countries that are accepting large payments from China for infrastructure. China is essentially buying off some countries, turning them into vassal states. And there are reports that in some of those countries, they do allow Chinese police to operate. That is not what's happening here. We have to be very concerned about this. I would consider this Chinese interference, Chinese intimidation in the internal affairs of Canada and then the lives of Chinese Canadians who left and came here for a reason. But we have to be careful when we call them Chinese police stations. It's a serious issue. Prime Minister Trudeau's raised it with Chinese President Xi. But I would caution on all fronts here.
Brian, let's talk about Bill C-21, a hot button topic right now, the Liberals' gun ban bill. The Trudeau government continues to focus on legal gun owners and changes to C-21, which would potentially include hunting rifles, which has angered a large number of Canadians, including Carey Price with the Montreal Canadiens. In fact, you have him, on the front page of The Sun? Why don't you show our viewers
It's
there?
on the front page of The Sun with the headline that says price change, because up until Carey Price spoke out about this, the Trudeau government's response to anyone who said, look, your latest changes are going to include hunting rifles and shotguns, their response was, that's disinformation. That's not true. You're lying. You're making things up. We could all see the list. We could see things like the Webley and Scott waterfowl shotgun. How this is an old British hunting shotgun that you're more likely to see an aristocrat using if you're watching The Crown or Downton Abbey on Netflix than you are to see at a crime scene in Canada. But time and again, the Trudeau Liberals just ignored the media. They ignored the Conservative opposition. They ignored groups like the CCFR or the CCSA. They just said it's not true. Carey Price did one simple post to Instagram saying, I'm not a criminal. I love my family. I love my country. I look after my neighbor. What Justin Trudeau's doing is unjust. That got picked up big time in Francophone media across Quebec because, of course, he is a Habs great. He's an incredible goalie. He's played on the international stage for Canada. Um, so this guy carries weight. One simple post. Trudeau changed and on Monday was saying, we're listening to the concerns of hunters. They went from saying, this isn't happening to we're listening. That's a major change. And I can tell you, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet and the NDP, which still represent some rural ridings, they're feeling the heat and they are reconsidering their support for these changes. I think Bill C-21 overall will go through, but there will be some changes before this passes.
But Brian, there was a major gun bust in Toronto recently, and none of the guns that were confiscated were in fact hunting rifles.
No, none at all. So there were 62 firearms seized. There were 5 AR-15s. 4 of those could not be traced. They had their serial numbers, swiped off. But most insiders will tell you they believe they came from the United States. These 62 firearms mainly came from Arizona and Texas. They were smuggled into Canada. Only one of the 62 actually came from Canada. It was a stolen handgun. So that shows you where the problem is. The problem is smuggled firearms, not not rifles and shotguns that are used for hunting, not even rifles that you think look scary but are used for target shooting. That's not the problem in Canada. And Toronto Police Chief James Raymer said as much during his news conference, and he called for changes in how bail is administered. The main guy in this gun smuggling ring, he's facing a bunch of charges, including a number of charges related to his prohibition order against possessing guns. How do you get a prohibition order against possessing guns? Serious crimes in the past. In fact, 7 years ago, he was facing murder charges for allegedly shooting somebody. I don't know if he was ever convicted, allegedly shooting somebody in broad daylight. So, we're talking about repeat offenders getting out on bail. Chief Raymer says we've got to fix that system. We've got to have serious penalties. Instead, the Trudeau government's going the other way, reducing penalties for repeat gun crime offenders through Bill C-22, the one that goes along with his gun control bill, C-21.
Brian, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has made it perfectly clear he does not like Alberta's sovereignty within the United Canada Act. Now, will the Trudeau Liberals actually do anything about it, as many, including Alberta NDP leader Rachel Notley, has requested?
I think Rachel Notley's effectively asked the federal government to intervene and nullify an Alberta statute. That would be a tremendous incursion into provincial powers. Look, I have questions about whether some aspects of the Solidarity Act or Sovereignty Act, sorry, are legal or constitutional, but much of it reads like statements you'd see on any given day from Quebec politicians. And you never see the outcry over that when it's Quebec, but you see it when it's Alberta. It's much like here in Ontario. Doug Ford used the notwithstanding clause. It's used all the time in Quebec. It doesn't cause an outrage when Quebec does it. It did when Doug Ford did it. Effectively, for the central Canadian commentariat, if you're not from Quebec, and especially if you're a conservative-minded politician, if you do something they don't like, they're going to yell and scream. If Quebec does it, they're going to stay silent. There's an absolute double standard going on. We've seen this play out before with things like the firewall letter, where people say, how dare Alberta ask for the ability to collect its own taxes or have its own pension plan or its own provincial police force? All things that Quebec does. Ontario has its own provincial police force. There's nothing that says Alberta must use the RCMP from here to eternity. But anytime that Alberta tries to flex its muscle just a little bit, Central Canadians act as if you are trying to leave the country, and they get more upset than they do at Quebec actually trying to leave the country.
Wow. Brian, a news organization was escorted out of the Parliamentary Press Gallery by armed police. Blacklock's is out on the Hill. What happened there?
This is a story that involves an awful lot of personalities, a lot of personal disputes. Is there perhaps a bit of anger, resentment towards Blacklocks, which goes in a different way, that pokes and prods at the other media outlets for taking government subsidies? I would believe so, but there's a lot of personal stuff going on here as well. I'm not sure I want to get into all of that. I've known Tom Korski for quite a few years. He was on Parliament Hill when I would use the hot room. There was a dispute over how he was behaving in the hot room. That's a communal office that small bureaus tend to use. So if you've only got one or sometimes two people on the Hill, you use the hot room. You're sitting in basically office pods. And so people said he was impolite, he was too loud. Nothing that I think requires you being kicked out of the gallery. But as I said, a lot of personal animosity between various people. And it really will perhaps shock people, but simply reminds me that the Parliamentary Press Gallery, of which I was a member for years, is really high school with salaries and Mean Girls, the movie, without the fashion sense or the snappy one-liners.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who's got a great sense of humor. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.